The amber glow of David's dual monitors was the only light left burning on the 14th floor of the State Street Financial Building. Outside, the Boston skyline was a jagged silhouette against a bruised, rainy November sky. It was 8:42 p.m. David rubbed the bridge of his nose, feeling the familiar, rhythmic throb of a tension headache taking root behind his eyes. As a senior risk analyst, David's entire life was built on a single, unshakable faith: data does not lie. Human beings are messy, emotional, and prone to erratic pivots, but numbers? Numbers are honest. If an algorithm flag spiked, there was a reason. If a spreadsheet didn't balance, a human had made a mistake. He prided himself on finding those mistakes before they cost people millions. His phone buzzed on the mahogany desk, a sharp, brief vibration that startled him in the dead silence of the office. He picked it up, expecting an automated notification from his calendar or a news alert. Instead, the screen displayed a push notification from Found, a high-end, encrypted family tracking app he and his wife, Sarah, had installed a year ago after a string of high-profile carjackings in their Beacon Hill neighborhood. Found alert: Sarah Harrison has arrived at the Whispering Pines Motel, Raynham, Massachusetts. David frowned. Raynham? That was nearly 40 miles south of the city, a desolate stretch off Route 20, known mostly for gray industrial parks and hourly rate motels. Sarah was supposed to be at her desk at the Vanguard Group downtown, wrapping up a quarterly audit. She had texted him at 6 o'clock saying she'd be trapped under a mountain of compliance paperwork until at least 10. He tapped the notification, opening the app's satellite map. The little glowing green dot representing Sarah's iPhone was stationary, pinned directly over a flat, U-shaped roof surrounded by asphalt and dense patch of woods. A glitch, David muttered to the empty room. His voice sounded thin, hollowed out by exhaustion. App servers lagged. GPS towers pinged off the wrong relays all the time. It was a simple data anomaly. Yet, a cold, irrational finger of dread traced its way down his spine. Sarah was a creature of absolute habit. She drove a silver Volvo XC60, took the same route to work, and viewed anything south of Quincy as uncharted territory. To clear his mind and stop the stupid, creeping anxiety from taking hold, David did what any modern husband would do. He hit the FaceTime icon next to her name. He wanted to see her face, hear the soft, slightly stressed cadence of her voice, and have her laugh at how a cheap piece of software thought she was at a sleazy roadside motel. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th ring, the call connected. The screen flickered, and there she was. The background was unmistakable, the bright, sterile fluorescent lighting of her corner office at Vanguard. Behind her, the floor-to-ceiling glass window reflected the distant, rain-streaked lights of the financial district. Sarah was wearing her favorite tailored royal blue blazer, her blonde hair pulled back into a neat, professional low ponytail. A few stray strands framed her face, looking exactly as they always did when she was deep into a 12-hour workday. She adjusted her reading glasses and smiled, though her eyes remained tired. "Hey, honey," she said, her voice smooth and comforting through the speaker. "Everything okay? You usually don't FaceTime this late unless something's up." David felt a massive wave of relief wash over him, so intense it made him feel slightly foolish. He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "Hey, yeah, everything's fine. Just taking a break from the spreadsheets. I saw you were still at it." "Ugh, don't remind me," Sarah sighed, leaning back in her ergonomic mesh chair. She picked up a white ceramic mug, taking a slow sip. The compliance team found a discrepancy in the mid-market funds. "I'm going to be staring at these numbers until my eyes bleed. What about you? When are you coming home?" David didn't answer immediately. His eyes were locked on the screen, but his brain, the hyper-analytical, pattern-recognizing engine that made him a master of his craft, had suddenly stopped listening to her words. It was focusing entirely on the data. Sarah loved her coffee black. She had hated sugar since she was a child, often joking that putting sweetness in coffee was a crime against dentistry. But as she set the mug back down on her desk, David watched a tiny, granular trail of white crystals glistening on the dark wood next to her keyboard. A stray grain of sugar. And on the edge of the white mug, there was a faint, pink smudge of lipstick. Sarah only wore nude lip balm to the office. She claimed lipstick made her feel like she was wearing a mask. David? She asked, her brow furrowing slightly on the screen. You still there? Yeah, David said, his voice dropping an octave. His heart gave a hard, erratic thud against his ribs. Yeah, sorry. Bad connection for a second. I'm wrapping up now. I'll probably head home in 20 minutes. Okay, good. Don't wait up for me, okay? Eat that leftover lasagna in the fridge. I love you. Love you too, David said. The screen went black. David sat in the silence of his office, his breathing shallow. He looked down at his phone. The Found app was still open in the background. The little green dot hadn't moved. It was still sitting squarely on top of room 114 of the Whispering Pines Motel, 40 miles away. If Sarah was in her office, her phone was at the motel. But she had answered his FaceTime call on her phone. The video quality had been crisp, HD, with no lag. David stood up, his chair rolling back and hitting the credenza with a sharp thud. He walked over to the glass window of his own office and looked out into the rain. His mind began to race, building a complex matrix of logic models, trying to solve the equation. Scenario A. The app is broken. It's a ghost location, but Found uses triple redundancy cellular triangulation. It doesn't just guess a location 40 miles away with a 99% accuracy radius. Scenario B. She left her phone in a rental car, or someone stole it. But she just answered it. She held it in her hand. He saw the angle shift as she picked it up. Scenario C. The video wasn't real. David's hands went cold. He sat back down at his desk and pulled up the Vanguard Group's public corporate directory on his computer. He looked at the live webcam feed of the building's main lobby, a security feature accessible to tenants and premium partners. The lobby was empty. The security guard was reading a magazine. Then, he opened his personal laptop and began to analyze the FaceTime call logs, extracting the metadata using a basic network diagnostic tool he kept for troubleshooting. The IP address that had authenticated the video stream didn't originate from the Boston corporate backbone. It originated from a regional Comcast commercial hub located in Bristol County, the county where Raynham was. The room seemed to tilt. The woman he had just spoken to looked like his wife. She dressed like his wife. She sat in an office that looked exactly like his wife's office, down to the framed picture of their honeymoon in Kyoto sitting on the credenza behind her. But the data was screaming at him. The call had come from the motel. David reached into his desk drawer and pulled out his car keys. His movements were slow, deliberate, entirely stripped of emotion. When the numbers don't make sense, you don't panic. You don't make a scene. You go out into the field, and you verify the source material. He walked out of the office, leaving the lights on. The drive down Route 24 was a blur of sweeping windshield wipers and the rhythmic, hypnotic hum of tires cutting through standing water. David kept his speed precisely at 5 miles hours above the limit. Fast enough to make time, slow enough to avoid drawing the attention of the state troopers who liked to camp out in the dark medians near Brockton. His hands griped the steering wheel at 10 and 2. His knuckles were white, but his breathing remained steady, a practiced override of his body's fight-or-flight response. As a risk analyst, he knew that panic was a luxury of the ill-informed. Panic clouded judgment. Right now, he needed absolute, crystalline clarity. He kept the Volvo's center console display on the Found app. The green dot hadn't moved. It sat like a malignant little beacon over the coordinates of the Whispering Pines Motel. Every few minutes, David would glance from the road to the screen, half hoping, half praying the signal would suddenly snap back to Beacon Hill or the financial district, exposing the whole thing as a spectacular, terrifying software glitch. It didn't. The data remained stubbornly, brutally consistent. By 9:35 p.m., David pulled off the highway at exit 13. The transition from the highway to the secondary roads felt like stepping backward in time. The sleek, glass and steel prosperity of Boston faded into a bleak landscape of shuttered strip malls, neon-lit liquor stores, and waterlogged pine trees. A mile down a poorly lit two-lane road, the sign for the Whispering Pines appeared. It was a vintage neon relic, the word motel buzzing with a sickly pink flicker, while the vacant sign beneath it bled a dull orange. The property was built in a classic 1960s motor lodge layout, a long, single-story concrete structure shaped like a horseshoe, with room doors facing a cracked asphalt parking lot. David didn't pull into the main lot. Instead, he turned into the gravel driveway of an abandoned diner adjacent to the property. He killed his headlights, shifted into park, and sat in the darkness, letting his eyes adjust. The rain drummed heavily against the roof of his car. Through the blurred glass of his side window, he surveyed the motel parking lot. There were only 4 cars parked outside the rooms. 3 were beat-up sedans, likely belonging to long-term residents. And then, parked directly under a flickering security light outside room 114, was a silver Volvo XC60. David's breath hitched. He didn't need to see the license plate to recognize the slight scratch on the rear bumper from when Sarah had backed into a high curb at the grocery store 3 months ago. It was her car. A cold numbness crept from the tips of his fingers up his arms. The impossible equation was hardening into a reality he could no longer deny. Sarah's car was here. Her phone was here. But less than an hour ago, he had looked into her eyes, and she had been sitting in her office at Vanguard, 40 miles away. Think, David commanded himself, pressing his palms against his forehead. Asterisk, break it down. Analyze the variables. Asterisk. If the car and the phone were here, then the woman he had married 4 years ago, the woman whose laugh he knew, whose quirks he adored, was either inside that room with another man, or something profoundly sinister was happening. But how could she be in 2 places at once? The FaceTime video hadn't been a pre-recorded clip. She had responded to his questions in real time. She had reacted to his voice. He needed to see inside room 114. David reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a small, high-powered LED flashlight, but he didn't turn it on. He slipped his wedding ring off his finger, placed it in the cup holder, and stepped out into the freezing rain. He pulled the hood of his dark jacket over his head and walked along the tree lines separating the abandoned diner from the motel lot, keeping close to the shadows of the overgrown pines. The air smelled of damp earth, exhaust fumes, and cheap heating oil. As he approached room 114, his heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird, but his footsteps were silent. He bypassed the front door, where a sliver of light escaped from beneath the threshold, and crept around to the back of the unit. Most of these old motels had small, high bathroom windows facing the rear woods. If he was lucky, the window would be cracked for ventilation, or the curtain would be loose. He squatted low beneath the exterior air conditioning unit, which was buzzing loudly, masking any sound he might make. He looked up. The bathroom window was frosted glass, but it was tilted open an inch. From inside, he could hear the faint sound of a television playing a low-rent reality show, punctuated by the occasional murmur of voices. A woman's voice laughed. It was a throatier, slightly sharper laugh than the one he was used to hearing at breakfast, but the pitch was undeniably Sarah's. "I'm telling you, he bought it completely," the woman said. Her tone was casual, laced with a smug arrogance that made David's stomach turn. He's a numbers guy? You throw a couple of realistic details at him, and his brain just fills in the blanks. He thinks I'm drowning in compliance paperwork right now. David frozen. He leaned closer to the gap in the window, his ear nearly touching the wet screen. A man's voice replied, deep and gravelly. "You're sure he won't just show up at your office to surprise you? You said he's done that before." "He won't," she scoffed. "He's exhausted. He's been working 80-hour weeks analyzing the Q4 risk portfolios. He's going straight home to eat leftover lasagna and sleep like a corpse. Besides, even if he did call the office landline, the call forwarding is set up perfectly." David's mind reeled. Call forwarding, the FaceTime call. The metadata had pointed here, to Bristol County. She hadn't been in her office. She had been sitting right inside this dingy motel room, using a green screen, a high-definition backdrop of her office, or a meticulously arranged set to deceive him. But why go to such extreme lengths? A normal affair didn't require Hollywood-level staging. A normal affair didn't involve replicating an entire corporate office corner to pull off a 10-minute lie. This wasn't just infidelity. This was a highly coordinated, psychological operation. "Did you get the signature?" the man asked. The sound of rustling papers drifted through the window. "Not yet," the woman replied. David heard the distinct clink of a glass being set down on a hard surface. He's too cautious. If I push the joint asset transfer too fast, his risk analyst radar will go off. I have to play the stressed, overwhelmed wife for a few more days. Let him think he's saving me by taking over the management of the trust. David felt the ground beneath his feet give way. The trust. 6 months ago, David's maternal grandfather had passed away, leaving him a substantial, untouched trust fund worth just over $2 million. Sarah had been the one to suggest they consolidate their accounts into a unified family trust for tax efficiency and future planning. He had agreed in principle, but his busy schedule had delayed the final paperwork. The woman inside wasn't just cheating on him. She was actively plotting to strip him of his inheritance. Well, tell Sarah to hurry it up, the man grunted. The creditors in Atlantic City aren't going to wait forever, and my patience with this little suburban housewife routine is wearing thin. David gasped, the sound catching in his throat. He had to bite his own lip to keep from making a noise. Tell Sarah to hurry it up. The man hadn't addressed the woman in the room as Sarah. He had spoken about Sarah in the third person. David's brain, frantic and hyperstimulated, tried to process the sentence. If the woman in the room wasn't Sarah, then who was she? And who had he been living with for the past 4 years? Before he could spiral further into the terrifying implication of those words, he heard footsteps approaching the bathroom door inside. I'm going to take a shower, the woman said, her voice getting closer to the window. Turn the heat up, it's freezing in here. David reacted on instinct. He dropped to his knees, pressed his back against the damp concrete foundation of the motel, and held his breath. The bathroom light clicked on, throwing a bright, frosted square of yellow light onto the wet leaves in front of him. Through the textured glass, he could see the silhouette of a woman reaching up to close the window. As her hand reached for the latch, the frosted glass briefly offered a clearer view through a clear spot in the seam. David looked up. The profile of the face was identical to his wife's. The nose, the jawline, the structure of the cheekbones. But as she reached up, her sleeve fell back, revealing a large, intricate tattoo of a black dahlia sprawling across her left forearm. Sarah's skin was completely unblemished. She had a phobia of needles and had never gotten a tattoo in her life. The window clicked shut, locking him out in the cold and the dark. David sat in the mud, the rain pouring down on his face, his mind fracturing under the weight of a truth that defied all logic. The woman in room 114 had his wife's face, his wife's voice, his wife's car, and his wife's phone. But she was not his wife. He wasn't just dealing with a cheating spouse. He was dealing with a ghost, a mirror image, a stranger who had successfully infiltrated the most sacred spaces of his life. And as he stared at the silver Volvo gleaming under the motel light, a horrifying question crystallized in his mind. Where was the real Sarah? The walk back to the Volvo was a masterclass in survival. David's boots sank into the mud, his soaked jacket weighing heavily on his shoulders, but his body moved with rigid, mechanical precision. He didn't look back at room 114. He didn't look at the silver Volvo XC60 parked under the flickering light. He climbed into his car, started the engine without turning on the headlights, and backed out of the abandoned diner's gravel driveway. Only when he was a mile down the dark road did he finally switch the headlights on and let out a breath that tore through his throat like a sob. His mind was a chaotic spreadsheet of anomalies. The tattoo. Sarah didn't have a tattoo. The sugar in the coffee. Sarah hated sugar. The lipstick. Sarah never wore it. Tell Sarah to hurry it up. The puzzle pieces were violently colliding in his head, but they weren't forming a picture that made sense. If the woman in that room wasn't Sarah, then who had he been sleeping next to for the past few weeks? Who had made him breakfast? Who had kissed him goodbye at the door? He drove aimlessly through the rain, his analytical brain fighting a losing battle against sheer, unadulterated terror. He needed data. He needed history. Instead of heading back toward the highway to Boston, David pulled into the parking lot of a 24-hour Walmart off Route 24. He needed a controlled environment, somewhere well-lit, mundane, and public where he could think without looking over his shoulder. He parked far from the entrance under a massive security pole, killed the engine, and pulled out his personal laptop. David plugged his phone into the laptop, tethering the cellular connection. He didn't go to social media. He didn't check their joint bank accounts yet. Instead, he went straight to the root of Sarah's digital footprint, her background check registry from when they had applied for the co-op board of their Beacon Hill brownstone 3 years ago. Because he was a risk analyst, he had kept the full, unredacted PDF report saved in an encrypted folder on his hard drive. He scrolled past her credit score, past her employment history at Vanguard, straight down to the vital statistics and public records. Full name * Sarah Eleanor Harrison, née Vance. Date of birth * September 14, 1992. Place of birth * Providence, Rhode Island. Immediate family * Thomas Vance, Father, deceased. Eleanor Vance. Mother, deceased. There was no mention of a sibling. No brother, no sister. Sarah had told him she was an only child, raised by an aunt after her parents died in a boating accident when she was 12. David's fingers hovered over the keyboard, slick with cold sweat. Think, David. Public records can be manipulated, or things can be omitted if they occurred out of state or under a different name. He opened a private browser and accessed a premium legal database he used for corporate compliance tracking. He paid the $20 fee to run a deep-tier genealogical and criminal search on Vance in the state of Rhode Island between 1990 and 2010. The search bar spun. Processing. When the results populated, David's breath caught in his throat. A digitized scan of a birth registry from Providence Memorial Hospital, dated September 14, 1992. There were 2 entries, separated by exactly 4 minutes. Infant A** Sarah Eleanor Vance. Infant B** Samantha Grace Vance. Identical twins. David stared at the screen, the fluorescent lights of the Walmart parking lot reflecting off his pale face. A twin. A secret, identical twin sister that Sarah had never once mentioned in the 5 years they had been together. Not during their long, late-night conversations when they were dating, not at their wedding, not when they discussed having children of their own. He leaned back in the driver's seat, closing his eyes. The betrayal didn't just feel interpersonal anymore. It felt structural. The foundation of his entire adult life was built on a lie of omission so massive it defied comprehension. He forced his eyes open and began digging into Samantha Grace Vance. This search took longer, branching into municipal court records and police blotters. Samantha's digital footprint wasn't a clean corporate trajectory like Sarah's. It was a jagged trail of destruction. In 2018, a grand larceny charge in San Diego, dismissed due to a technicality involving witness identification. In 2021, an arrest warrant in Las Vegas for check fraud and identity theft under the alias Samantha Fox. The mugshot wasn't available in the database, but the physical description matched Sarah exactly, down to the height, eye color, and a distinguishing feature noted by the arresting officer, a large black dahlia tattoo spanning the left forearm. Samantha, David whispered, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. The puzzle pieces finally clicked into place, snapping together with the brutal weight of an iron trap. The woman at the motel wasn't an affair partner pretending to be Sarah. The woman at the motel was Samantha. And Samantha had been living in his house, using his wife's name, driving his wife's car, and sleeping in his bed. But that realization brought a fresh, paralyzing wave of horror. If Samantha was here, performing a flawless imitation of Sarah to help her boyfriend clear his gambling debts, where was the real Sarah? David's mind immediately leaped to the worst-case scenario. Had Samantha harmed her sister? Was Sarah tied up in a basement somewhere? Or worse, buried in the woods off Route 24? The man in the motel room had said, "Tell Sarah to hurry it up." He had used quotation marks in his tone. He had implied that Sarah was a separate entity, someone who needed to cooperate. David pulled up his phone and opened the Found app again. He tracked the history of the location data over the last 3 weeks. Up until a month ago, Sarah's phone spent its days exclusively at the Vanguard building and their brownstone. But 22 days ago, there was a 6-hour gap where the phone went offline completely. When it came back online, it was at a luxury spa resort in the Berkshires, a trip Sarah had told him was a solo corporate wellness retreat sponsored by her firm. David remembered that weekend vividly. When she came back, she had been incredibly affectionate, almost overwhelmingly so. She had initiated intimacy in a way that felt different, hungrier, less familiar. He had chalked it up to her being relaxed from the spa. It wasn't Sarah, his brain screamed. That was the switch. That was the day Samantha walked into your life. He began checking his personal bank accounts through his laptop. He bypassed the daily checking and went straight to the Vanguard mutual funds and his primary investment portfolio. Everything looked normal. The balances were intact. Then he checked the pending documents queue for his grandfather's trust fund. There it was. An electronic signature request form, initiated 3 days ago from Sarah's corporate email address. It was a power of attorney and asset consolidation form. It required his digital signature and a remote notary authorization. If he signed it, the $2 million would be transferred directly into a new, joint high-yield account at a private bank in the Cayman Islands, an account David had never heard of. Samantha hadn't stolen the money yet. She was waiting for him to sign the papers. And she was using her identical face and a hyper-realistic virtual setup to keep him compliant, keeping up the illusion that she was working late at the office so he wouldn't ask too many questions about why she was acting strange at home. David felt a sudden, violent surge of nausea. He rolled down the window, letting the freezing rain splash against his face until the urge to vomit passed. The sheer scale of the manipulation was staggering. They had mapped out his routine, analyzed his psychology, and weaponized his trust against him. They knew he was a man who respected boundaries, a man who wouldn't barge into his wife's office unannounced if she said she was drowning in a compliance audit. They had used his own decency as a weapon to blindfold him. He closed his laptop with a sharp snap. The easy, instinctive reaction would be to call the police right now, drive back to the motel with a dozen cruisers, and have them kick the door down. But David's risk analyst brain, shaking off the initial shock, began to calculate the probabilities. If he called the local police, what would he tell them? My wife has an identical twin sister I didn't know about, and I think she's pretending to be my wife to steal my money. Without concrete proof of a crime, without knowing where the real Sarah was, and with Samantha holding a legal identity that looked exactly like Sarah's, it would devolve into a messy, protracted investigation. Samantha and her boyfriend would get spooked. They would delete the digital trails, liquidate whatever they could, and vanish. And if Sarah was being held hostage, a premature police raid might sign her death warrant. No, he couldn't go to the police yet. Not until he knew the full scope of the conspiracy. He needed to know exactly who was driving the bus, Samantha or Sarah herself. Asterisk, tell Sarah to hurry it up. Asterisk, the phrase echoed in his mind again. Why would Samantha need to tell Sarah to hurry up if Sarah was the victim? Unless Sarah wasn't a victim at all. David gripped the steering wheel so hard his wrists began to ache. The thought was a radioactive spike in his chest, but he forced himself to look at it objectively. Sarah had access to the Vanguard systems. Sarah knew about the trust fund. Sarah knew his schedule better than anyone. What if the embezzlement his wife had been complaining about for months wasn't a corporate crisis she was trying to solve? What if she was the one who embezzled the money, and she had brought her grifter twin sister in to help her pull off the ultimate exit strategy? He needed to verify. He needed to play the game. David put the car in drive and pulled out of the Walmart parking lot, heading back toward Boston. The storm was beginning to clear, the rain tapering off into a dismal, gray mist. It was almost midnight by the time he pulled up to his beautiful, historic brownstone in Beacon Hill. He parked his car, walked up the brick steps, and unlocked the heavy oak front door. The house was quiet, smelling faintly of the lavender candles Sarah loved to burn. He walked into the kitchen. On the counter was a post-it note in neat, slightly rushed handwriting. Asterisk, leftover lasagna in the fridge, honey. Still stuck at the office. Don't wait up. Hugs and kisses. Asterisk. David stared at the note. He knew, with absolute certainty, that the woman who wrote this note was currently 40 miles away in a sleazy motel room, washing a black dahlia tattoo under a cheap shower head. He crumpled the note in his fist, tossed it into the trash, and walked up the stairs to their empty bedroom. He undressed in the dark, climbed into the cold bed, and lay there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the imposter to come home. The click of the front door lock at 1:14 a.m. felt like a gunshot in the silent brownstone. David lay perfectly still in the dark master bedroom, his eyes fixed on the ceiling plaster. He didn't move a muscle. He didn't adjust his breathing. He had spent the last hour consciously modulating his respiration, training his body to mimic the deep, heavy rhythm of a man lost in exhaustion. Downstairs, the floorboards groaned under familiar, light footsteps. He heard the rustle of a damp coat being hung in the closet, the soft click of the kitchen cabinets, and the faint sound of a glass running water under the tap. Then, the slow, deliberate ascent up the carpeted stairs. The bedroom door creaked open. A sliver of light from the hallway cut across the bed, illuminating the edge of the comforter. David closed his eyes to slits, watching through his eyelashes. She walked in. She was wearing the royal blue blazer, her blonde hair still pinned back in that neat, corporate low ponytail. She looked tired, her shoulders slumped in a perfect imitation of a woman who had just survived a 12-hour shift at a financial firm. She set her leather tote bag down on the armchair, slipped off her heels, and approached the bed. She stood over him for a long, agonizing 10 seconds. David felt her gaze drilling into him, searching for any sign of wakefulness. He forced his jaw to remain slack, letting out a soft, guttural snore. Apparently satisfied, she turned away, unbuttoning the blazer as she walked into the master bathroom. She shut the door, but she didn't click it fully into the frame. A bright line of yellow light poured into the bedroom, accompanied by the sound of the faucet running. Through the gap in the door, David watched her reflection in the vanity mirror. The exhaustion on her face vanished instantly. Her expression shifted into something cold, calculating, and sharp. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a second, sleek burner phone, and began typing rapidly with one hand. With her other hand, she grabbed a wet washcloth, poured a liberal amount of rubbing alcohol onto it, and began scrubbing vigorously at her left forearm. David watched as the flesh-colored, heavy waterproof makeup began to melt away, revealing the jagged, dark ink of the black dahlia tattoo beneath. A cold, heavy knot of hatred tightened in David's chest. Seeing the physical deception happen right before his eyes stripped away the last lingering threads of doubt. This was a monster wearing his wife's skin. She finished cleaning her arm, wrapped a long, flesh-colored elastic bandage over the tattoo to keep it hidden in case her sleeves slid up during sleep, and threw her clothes into the hamper. When she walked back into the dark bedroom wearing one of Sarah's silk nightgowns, David feigned a sleepy roll to the opposite side of the bed, turning his back to her. She climbed in beside him. The mattress shifted. The scent of her, the lavender soap she had used to mimic Sarah, mixed with a faint, underlying smell of cheap motel ozone and cigarette smoke from her boyfriend, filled the space between them. When she reached out and placed a gentle, delicate hand on his hip, it took every ounce of David's psychological discipline not to violently throw her off the bed. He merely grunted, pretending to sink deeper into sleep. The next morning, the psychological chess match began in earnest. David woke up at 6:30 a.m., just as he always did. When he went downstairs, Samantha was already in the kitchen, wearing a white plush robe, pouring coffee. "Morning, honey," she said, offering a bright, warm smile. She pushed a white ceramic mug toward him. "You were dead to the world last night. I tried to be quiet when I came in." David looked at the mug. He saw a tiny, stray crystal of white sugar stuck to the rim. "Thanks," David said, his voice flat, perfectly masking the adrenaline surging through his veins. He picked up the mug, took a sip, and forced himself to swallow the sickly sweet liquid without changing his expression. "Wow, that's different." Samantha frozen for a fraction of a second, her coffee pot hovering in midair. "What is?" "The roast." David lied smoothly, looking directly into her eyes. "It's a bit sweeter than usual. Did you buy a new blend?" A visible wave of relief washed over her features, though she masked it instantly with a soft laugh. "Oh yeah? I tried a new organic vanilla roast from the market. Do you like it?" "It's fine," David said, setting the mug down. He picked up his iPad, pulling up his daily market charts to maintain his routine. "How did the audit go last night? Did you find the discrepancy in the mid-market funds?" Samantha sat across from him, cradling her own mug. "Ugh, don't remind me. It's a total disaster. The compliance team is breathing down my neck. Honestly, David, it's getting to be too much. I had a minor panic attack in the restroom last night." She reached across the marble island, covering his hand with hers. Her palm was warm, but it felt like dry ice against his skin. "I'm really starting to think I need to step back from Vanguard. I can't handle the stress anymore." David looked down at her hand. "You've worked so hard for that partnership, Sarah. It's not like you to just walk away." "I know," she sighed, her voice trembling with a masterfully fabricated vulnerability. "But health comes first. That's why I was thinking, maybe we really should finalize that family trust paperwork we talked about. If we consolidate the assets and let your investment firm manage the capital, I can take a 6-month sabbatical without feeling like a financial burden to you." There it is, David thought. The hook. She was leveraging his protective instincts, using a fake mental health crisis to make him sign the papers. If he was the clueless, trusting husband she thought he was, he would have signed anything right then and there to relieve her stress. "I understand," David said, his voice dripping with gentle empathy. He squeezed her hand back, suppressing the urge to squeeze until the bones cracked. Your health is everything to me. Tell you what, send me the final documents link again. I'll review the terms during my lunch break today and get it taken care of. Samantha's eyes sparked with a sudden, triumphant hunger that she couldn't completely hide. Really? Thank you, David. You have no idea how much weight that lifts off my shoulders. I'll email the notary link to your personal account right now. Of course, David smiled. We're a team. 10 minutes later, David was out the door. But he didn't go to his office at State Street. Instead, he drove to a secure, private office space in the Back Bay district. 3 hours ago, while lying awake in the dark next to the imposter, he had used his encrypted laptop to hire Marcus Vance, no relation to Sarah, a high-end private investigator who specialized in corporate espionage and high-net-worth asset protection. Marcus was a former federal agent, a man who understood discretion and knew how to operate in the shadows without tripping legal alarms. The office was small, sterile, and smelled of stale espresso. Marcus, a broad-shouldered man with a salt-and-pepper beard and tired, intelligent eyes, sat behind a desk covered in monitors. David laid it all out. He didn't emotionally spiral. He presented the facts like a forensic financial audit. He showed Marcus the found app logs, the IP address routing from the FaceTime call, the Rhode Island birth records of the Vance twins, and the pending digital signature request for the $2 million trust transfer. Marcus listened in absolute, heavy silence, his fingers laced over his stomach. When David finished, the investigator let out a long, low whistle. You're a cool customer, David, Marcus said, leaning forward. Most guys would have broken a chair over that motel door last night. If I did that, I'd lose the money, and I'd never find out what happened to my wife, David said, his voice devoid of tremor. I need to know where Sarah is, and I need to know if she's a victim or the architect. Marcus tapped his keyboard, pulling up a secondary database. Well, let's look at the logistics. Samantha is a professional grifter. She doesn't have the technical know-how to route call forwarding through a corporate backbone or set up a synchronized green screen stream that matches a specific office layout. She needed inside access. She needed Sarah's credentials, her login tokens, and her schedule. Marcus turned one of the monitors toward David. It showed a map of the Berkshires, specifically the area surrounding the luxury spa resort where Sarah had reportedly gone 3 weeks ago. I ran a cell tower dump for that weekend, Marcus explained, pointing to a red cluster on the grid. Sarah's phone registered at the resort. But do you know what else registered on the exact same tower? A burner phone registered to a disposable LLC in New Jersey. That burner phone has been traveling with Sarah, or rather, Samantha, ever since. What about the man at the motel? David asked. His name is Julian Cross, Marcus said, snapping a photo onto the screen. It was the man David had seen through the motel window. A high-stakes gambler with ties to underground casinos in Atlantic City and Boston. He's currently facing indictment for a massive check-kiting scheme. He owes dangerous people a lot of money. Samantha is his girlfriend. They've been pulling small-time identity scams together for years. Marcus paused, looking at David with a cautious, empathetic expression. David, I dug into Vanguard's internal regulatory filings. 2 months ago, an internal audit flagged a series of unauthorized offshore transfers from a mid-market fund Sarah managed. Totaled about $400,000. The investigation was being kept quiet, but the loop was closing. Sarah was going to be caught. The air left David's lungs. The final piece of the terrifying equation slammed into place. She wasn't drowning in compliance paperwork, David whispered, the reality crushing down on his chest like a lead weight. She was drowning in her own crime. Exactly, Marcus said grimly. Sarah embezzled the money, likely to help Julian or her sister. When the firm started investigating, she knew her life was over. So she brought Samantha in. Samantha takes Sarah's place, plays the stressed wife, extracts your $2 million inheritance, transfers it to the Caymans, and then Sarah vanishes into thin air, leaving you holding an empty bag and a fraudulent marriage. And the real Sarah? David asked, his voice cracking for the first time. Where is she? Marcus tapped the map, zooming in on a remote, isolated patch of land 20 miles north of the Berkshires resort. Julian Cross rents a hunting cabin up here under a fake name. According to the data, that New Jersey burner phone makes a short, 10-minute call to a landline at that cabin every single day at noon. Marcus looked at David. She's up there, waiting for her sister to finish robbing you. The drive back from the private investigator's office to the State Street building felt like walking through a wake. David stared at the gray asphalt, his mind a battlefield of cold calculations and shattering memories. For 4 years, he had shared a bed, a home, and a life with Sarah. He remembered the way she used to crinkle her nose when she laughed, the quiet Sundays they spent reading by the fireplace, and the fiercely protective way she had held his hand at his grandfather's funeral. He had believed, with every fiber of his being, that they were a fortress built against the chaos of the world. To discover that she wasn't the victim, that she was the architect of his ruin, was a psychological amputation. She hadn't just allowed a stranger to violate their home. She had handed over the keys. She had traded his love, his trust, and his inheritance to bail out a low-life gambler and a criminal sister. Data does not lie, he reminded himself, his jaw tightening until his teeth ached. People do. He arrived at his office at 12:45 p.m. The corporate environment, usually a sanctuary of predictable numbers, now felt like a stage set. He sat at his desk, opened his laptop, and stared at the email notification waiting in his personal inbox. It was the secure DocuSign link from Sarah, sent exactly at noon. David didn't click it. Instead, he opened a private, secure terminal and dialed a number Marcus had given him, a direct line to a senior investigator within the FBI's white-collar crime division in Boston. Agent Reynolds, a gruff, alert voice answered. "My name is David Harrison," David said, his voice dropping into a calm, chillingly precise register. "I am a senior risk analyst at State Street. I am currently the target of a multi-state identity fraud and grand larceny conspiracy involving bank embezzlement. And I have the digital infrastructure, IP addresses, and physical locations of the perpetrators ready for a federal wiretap." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, followed by the sharp sound of a keyboard rustling. "Go ahead, Mr. Harrison. I'm listening." For the next 2 hours, David orchestrated the trap. He didn't act like a grieving, betrayed husband. He acted like the chief risk officer of his own life. He provided Reynolds with the cloned device metadata, the corporate access log Samantha had used to spoof the FaceTime call, the forensic trail of Sarah's embezzlement at Vanguard, and the exact coordinates of the hunting cabin in the Berkshires. "We can secure federal warrants for wire fraud and interstate conspiracy by tomorrow morning," Agent Reynolds said, his tone laced with professional respect. "But to catch them red-handed, we need the transfer to be initiated. We need Samantha to attempt to move the funds, and we need proof that she is executing the transaction under a fraudulent identity." "I'll give you the execution," David said coldly. "But I want the traps sprung simultaneously. I want the cabin raided the exact moment Samantha thinks she's won." "Understood. We'll coordinate with the Massachusetts State Police Tactical Unit near the Berkshires. Keep your schedule normal, Mr. Harrison. Don't let her know you're onto them." David hung up the phone. He looked out the window at the harbor. The storm had passed, leaving the water flat, gray, and unforgiving. The chess pieces were on the board. When David returned to the Beacon Hill brownstone that evening at 6:30 p.m., the house smelled of garlic and rosemary. Samantha was in the kitchen, wearing a chic linen dress, humming a melody as she stirred a pot of pasta sauce. She looked radiant, energized by the proximity of her payday. "Hey, stranger," she said, turning around and offering her lips for a kiss. David leaned down and kissed her cheek, his skin crawling at the contact. He felt the phantom shape of the elastic bandage hidden beneath her long cardigan sleeve, concealing the black dahlia dawning on her skin. "Smells incredible," David said, forcing a weary smile as he untied his tie. "I had a brutal day. The market is violently volatile right now." "Oh, honey," Samantha said, her eyes softening with that perfect, practiced look of marital devotion. She poured him a glass of red wine and handed it to him. "You worked too hard, did you? Did you get a chance to look at that paperwork I sent over? The compliance team at Vanguard gave me a final notice today. If I don't submit my medical sabbatical request and the asset consolidation by tomorrow morning, they might initiate a formal review." She was tightening the screws, using fake time constraints to induce panic. It was a classic social engineering tactic. David took a slow sip of the wine. "I did. I reviewed the terms during my lunch break. It all looks standard, Sarah. I actually filled out my portion of the authentication, but the private banking server required a dual-factor biometric confirmation from our home IP address to authorize the high-value escrow route. Samantha's breath caught, her eyes widening slightly. Oh, really? So, we just need to do it here. Yes, David said, pulling his laptop out of his leather briefcase and setting it on the dining table. I have the terminal open. Once we both sign and verify the remote notary video link, the $2 million will be routed into the consolidated escrow account. Let's do it now, she said, her voice a little too fast, a little too eager. She quickly wiped her hands on a dish towel and sat next to him at the table. David opened the laptop screen. The interface wasn't the standard private banking portal. It was a modified front-end designed by Marcus and the FBI, a digital mirror that looked identical to the Cayman private bank, but was actually an untraceable federal escrow holding cell, rigged with a localized keystroke tracker and a high-definition webcam recorder. All right, David said, pointing to the screen. Type in your Vanguard corporate credential token to authorize the joint transfer. Samantha didn't hesitate. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, typing in Sarah's private corporate encrypted password and generating the security token. She was so blinded by the finish line that she didn't notice the tiny, red diagnostic script running in the corner of the taskbar, capturing every packet of data. System alert, external IP verified. Geolocation, Beacon Hill, Boston. Target authenticated as Vance, Samantha, ***. There, Samantha said, leaning back with a breathless, triumphant smile. It's done on my end. Now you just have to click authorize. David looked at the flashing blue button on the screen. Authorize transfer. He knew that the moment he clicked this button, the digital signal would alert Agent Reynolds. The federal wiretap would close, the bank fraud would be legally executed, and 40 miles away, a tactical team would breach the door of a remote cabin in the woods. He looked at Samantha. She was staring at the screen, her reflection caught in the glass, her eyes filled with a predatory, desperate hunger. She thought she was looking at a fool. She thought she had successfully erased her sister's life and stripped an innocent man of his future. David smiled, a slow, genuine, terrifying smile that didn't reach his eyes. You know, Sarah, David said softly, his hand resting on the mouse. I've been thinking a lot about our anniversary trip to Kyoto last year. Remember that beautiful temple we visited? The one with the rock gardens. Samantha blinked, momentarily thrown off by the sudden shift in topic. Oh yes, of course, honey. It was beautiful. You told me something there that always stuck with me, David continued, his finger hovering over the clicker. You said that the truth is like water. No matter how deep you bury it, it always finds a way to rise to the surface. Samantha's smile faltered, a sudden, sharp instinct of danger flaring in her eyes. David, why are you bringing that up now? Just click the button so we can eat. I am clicking it, David said. He clicked. The digital click of the mouse echoed like a falling guillotine in the quiet dining room. On the screen, the progress bar flared to life, a sleek blue line loading across the interface. Asterisk transferring assets, 25%, 50%, 75%, asterisk. Samantha let out a shaky, audible breath, her fingers tightening on the edge of the marble table. She was so close. A few more seconds, and $2 million would vanish into the digital ether of the Cayman Islands, and she could finally drop this pathetic, suffocating suburban housewife act. There, David said, his voice terrifyingly calm as the screen flashed a green confirmation box. Transaction complete. Funds in escrow. Oh, thank God. Samantha breathed, instinctively reaching out to close the laptop. It's finally done. Now we can finally relax. David, I'll go get the dinner plates. Don't bother, David said. He didn't move. He didn't raise his voice. He simply leaned back in his chair, folding his hands over his knee, and looked at her. The gentle, accommodating husband she had spent 3 weeks manipulating had completely vanished. In his place sat a stranger with eyes as cold and gray as winter flint. Samantha froze, her hand hovering over the laptop lid. A sudden, instinctual prickle of danger raced down her spine. David, what's wrong with you? You're acting strange. I should ask you the same thing, Samantha, David said smoothly. The name hit the room like a physical blow. Samantha's face drained of color so fast it made her look ghostly under the pendant lights. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Her mind scrambled, trying to calculate how he could possibly know, searching for a way to laugh it off. Samantha, she forced a brittle, high-pitched laugh, her hand dropping back to her side. Honey, who is Samantha? Did you have too much wine? I'm Sarah, your wife. My wife doesn't take sugar in her coffee, David stated, his voice a steady, rhythmic cadence of facts. My wife doesn't wear pink lipstick to a corporate audit. And my wife certainly doesn't have a black dahlia tattooed on her left forearm. Samantha's hand instinctively flew to her long cardigan sleeve, pulling it down tightly over her wrist. The defensive movement was an absolute admission of guilt. Her eyes darted toward the front door, her body tensing, preparing to bolt. I wouldn't, David cautioned, noticing the subtle shift in her weight. The front door is locked from the outside. And that laptop you just used? It didn't route to the Caymans. It routed to a federal holding escrow monitored by the FBI's white-collar crime division. Every keystroke you typed, every corporate credential you entered, and your face on that webcam, it's all been logged as evidence of interstate wire fraud and grand larceny. Samantha's facade shattered entirely. The sweet, vulnerable expression she had worn for weeks twisted into something ugly, feral, and desperate. She lunged across the table, grabbing the laptop, but David calmly closed the lid and pinned it down with one hand. You bastard, she hissed, her voice dropping into the throaty, harsh register David had heard through the motel window. You think you're so smart? You don't know anything. You think Sarah is the innocent one here? She hates you, David. She's been robbing her own firm for months, and she came to me to help her clean out your pathetic little inheritance. Even if you catch me, she's gone. You'll never find her. I don't need to find her, David replied, pulling his phone from his pocket and laying it face up on the table. The FBI already did. He tapped a button, activating a live audio feed from Agent Reynolds. Through the speaker, over the sound of heavy static, came the distinct, chaotic noise of wood splintering, shouting men, and the blare of sirens. Asterisk, State Police. Put your hands where I can see them. Drop the weapon. Asterisk then, a sharp, piercing scream cut through the static. A scream David recognized instantly. It was Sarah, the real Sarah, crying out in terror as the tactical team breached the remote hunting cabin in the Berkshires. Asterisk, Target 1 secured. Target 2, Julian Cross, is in custody. Asterisk, an officer's voice reported over the radio. Samantha stared at the phone, her chest heaving, her entire world collapsing in a matter of seconds. The master plan, the perfect double life, the flawless exit strategy, all taken apart by a man who simply paid attention to the data. Before she could speak, the heavy oak front door of the brownstone shuttered. A loud, authoritative knock rattled the glass panels. Federal agents. Open the door. David stood up, smoothing the front of his shirt. He looked down at the woman who had invaded his home, feeling no anger, no hatred, only a profound, liberating sense of closure. Dinner is going to get cold, David said softly. He walked past her toward the front door, leaving her alone in the light of the kitchen, trapped in the ruins of her own reflection. The heavy oak door swung open, and the narrow hallway of the Beacon Hill brownstone filled with the stark, utilitarian presence of federal agents. There were no flashing lights on the quiet residential street, no theatrical shouting, just the quiet, terrifying efficiency of the law. Two agents moved past David with practiced fluidity, entering the dining room where Samantha still stood frozen, her hands resting on the cold marble of the table. David watched as they read her rights. She didn't fight. The feral energy she had shown moments before evaporated, leaving her looking small, hollow, and exhausted. As they led her out past him in handcuffs, she didn't look at his face. She kept her eyes glued to the hardwood floor, her long cardigan sleeve slipping up just enough to expose the dark edge of the black dahlia tattoo against her pale skin. Mr. Harrison, Agent Reynolds said, stepping into the foyer and handing David a formal property receipt for the laptop. The tactical unit in the Berkshires has confirmed both Sarah Harrison and Julian Cross are processed. They found offshore routing numbers, fake passports, and the remainder of the embezzled Vanguard funds in a safe inside the cabin. Your wife is cooperating. She's already pinning the whole thing on her sister, but the wiretap audio says otherwise. They're both going away for a very long time. David looked at the document in his hand. The ink was fresh, the letters sharp and definitive. "Thank you, Agent. You did a brave thing tonight, son," Reynolds said, offering a firm, empathetic handshake. "Most people let their emotions burn the house down before they call us. You kept your head." "In my line of work," David said softly, "if you let your emotions dictate the risk, you lose everything." When the front door finally clicked shut and the agents left, the silence that settled over the brownstone was absolute. It wasn't the warm, peaceful silence of a home at rest. It was the heavy, echoing quiet of an empty stage after the curtains had closed. David walked slowly back into the kitchen. The burner under the pot of pasta sauce was still clicking, a low, blue flame keeping the red liquid bubbling. He reached out and turned the knob, killing the fire. He picked up the bottle of red wine Samantha had poured for him, walked over to the sink, and poured it down the drain, watching the dark liquid swirl and disappear. He sat down at the edge of the dining room table, the exact spot where he had sat next to an imposter an hour ago, and where he had imagined sitting with his true wife for the next 40 years. He didn't cry. The grief was there, a massive, crushing weight in the center of his chest, but it was matched by a profound, clinical clarity. The woman he had loved, the Sarah who crinkled her nose when she laughed, the woman he thought he was protecting, had never truly existed. She was a carefully constructed ledger of lies, a beautifully packaged investment that had turned out to be completely fraudulent. The emotional scars would take years to fade, but as he looked around the empty room, he realized something vital. He had survived. He hadn't broken. When his reality was violently attacked, he hadn't succumbed to the madness. He had used the truth as his armor. A month later, the brownstone was sold. David packed his life into a few cardboard boxes. Only his books, his grandfather's old vinyl records, and his clothes. Everything else, every piece of furniture, every painting, every shared dish, was left behind or sold. He didn't want the ghosts. He moved into a smaller, sunlit loft apartment in the Seaport district, overlooking the water. It was minimalist, clean, and entirely his own. On his first morning in the new place, David stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, watching the sunrise paint the Atlantic Ocean in shades of brilliant orange and gold. The coffee maker behind him beeped, signaling it was done. He walked over, poured the dark, rich liquid into a plain black ceramic mug, and took a sip. It was bitter, bold, and completely black. No sugar, no illusions. He looked out at the horizon, feeling the cool morning air against his face. The data of his life had been completely wiped clean, the old accounts closed forever. But as he stood there, independent, secure, and entirely free, David smiled. He had lost a fake marriage, but he had gained something infinitely more valuable, a completely genuine life.